1981, multimedia artist Laurie Anderson released her hit single, Oh Superman, one of her most celebrated and popular productions. The story is pretty well known at this point. The piece became a hit in the UK after John Peel played it on the radio, and shortly after, Anderson, a relatively obscure artist, was catapulted into the mainstream. The multimedia piece begins with Anderson's voice articulating the consistent repetition of the syllable ha on middle C through an Eventide Harmonizer, a studio processor first released in 1975 with pitch shifting, delay, and feedback capacities, among other effects. Anderson uses the Eventide Harmonizer to generate a continuous loop, which she's called electronic breathing. It's been variously interpreted as a sardonic laugh, a clinical but perhaps also erotic drone, a static monotone that seems to generate an affective aural detachment, is the ostinato backdrop of a piece that has circulated widely and been appropriated to index a whole range of military missions, technological failures, military coups, secret and illegal arms sales, terrorist attacks, and general geopolitical instability. In this paper, following Ronak Kapadia's claim that global politics of imperialism, war, terrorism, and militarism cannot be extracted from practices and processes of cultural mediation, I address how the widespread circulation and reanimation of Anderson's O Superman articulate the imperial logics of failure that are constitutive of American militarism. I consider failure within the context of what are often referred to as the forever wars, the constant state of war and state of emergency in which the US operates. This perpetual state of war has been widely theorized over the last decade. Lauren Ballant talks about the affective byproduct of being shaped by crisis, through which we look for ways of living to continue on, to organize feelings, create interpretations of our contemporary moment in an effort to persist under such conditions of crisis. According to Judith Butler, the forever wars maximize precarious for some and minimize precariousness for others. Within this or under this precariousness, Jasbir Puar demonstrates how state powers can both capacitate and take care of some while debilitating others and creating deteriorating conditions of livability or flourishing. Such risks are already accounted for in imperial projects. And here I want to document some of the ways that O Superman has circulated within this context of the forever wars. O Superman originated as a piece about the failed rescue mission of Americans being held at the American Embassy in Tehran, Iran, during the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981. In 1980, Operation Eagle Claw sought to rescue the 52 hostages being held at the American Embassy in Iran. Since the 1950s, the US Central Intelligence Agency has been very involved in different military coups d'etat in Iran through what have been referred to as westernization plans or the White Revolution. But in 1979, specifically, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had been in power since 1941, was overthrown during the Iranian Revolution, and instead of standing for trial, he fled to the US for protection, in part under the guise of seeking medical treatment. The hostage crisis was in part prompted by this last gesture, and revolutionary students stormed the American embassy and took hostages for what was eventually 444 days to protest that the Shah was being protected in the US at the time. The song also amassed attention again after the Iran-Contra affair in the mid-1980s, again in 1988, the Italian health ministry employed it in a television campaign for AIDS awareness and education in Italy. And it resurfaced again with renewed interest with audiences and cultural critics discussing the song's eerie prescience following the 9/11 attacks in New York City and on the Pentagon, when Anderson performed it at the Town Hall in New York City on September 19th and 20th, 2001, which was also released as an album. This song has been characterized as also being prescient of other American military and geopolitical events, and has been so malleable to each of these events that journalists and audiences, and even Anderson herself allegedly, have mistakenly attributed the song's origins to different events apart from the Iran hostage crisis. In at least one interview from 2003, Anderson reportedly said that Oh Superman was about the Iran-Contra affair, before adding, quote, "Americans have short memories. They don't realize that this is the same war that's been going on for 20 years, unquote. I won't be able to focus on all of these examples in this short presentation, but I want to talk more generally about how and maybe start to get at why this piece ends up standing in and articulating, engaging, and indexing so many military interventions and imperial projects. This paper explores failure through Superman, communications failure, technological failure, the failures of state power to deliver the supposedly benevolent outcomes of national security endeavors. And I read Superman as indexing a genealogy of voice processing as a military encryption technology, situating the piece within Susan McClary's discourse on the subversion of teleological forms, and also as emblematic of Carolyn Abate's writing on the tension of a drastic Gnostic divide. I take up Superman through this lens of failure. Following Jack Haberstam, thinking of failure as both a generative and possibly queer method, and through Judith Butler's writing on frames of war. Ultimately, I argue that the circulation of Superman exemplifies how failure is encrypted into expressions of national security and imperial logics more broadly. The process by which these failures are indexed in Anderson's work can be seen in part through the operations and cultural biographies of some of the tools that she uses in the piece. In addition to the innovative use of the H910, the harmonizer, the piece featured pairing the harmonizer with a vocoder, a speech synthesis encoder, which originated in Bell Research Laboratories and developed as a voice encryption military technology. So the vocoder, it's a speech coder that filters and resynthesizes the human voice to economize transmission bandwidth. So basically, part of the claim to fame or the military history of this tool is that it was used among Allied forces during the Second World War. The transmitting vocoder took a message, scrambled it in a different order, and the vocoder on the receiving end would reassemble the message. That the Bell Labs Corporation, now AT&T, is responsible for many of the modes of listening we engage today through digital media has been well researched and argued by scholars like Jonathan Stern and Dave Tompkins, among others. And Bell Labs, initially a telephone company, is now one of the world's largest companies specializing in corporate research. And it was Bell Labs that set the precedent of interpreting some vocal content as redundant or not necessary to get the message across in transmission, eliminating some content in the compression process. So when coupled with a keyboard synthesizer, the vocoder allows input speech to be harmonized. For example, we hear this in the piece when Anderson sings over A flat major and C minor chords. Oh, Superman, oh, Judge, oh, Mom and Dad, Mom and Dad, ha, 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 ha. Hi, I'm not home right now, but if you want to leave a message, just start talking at the sound of the tone. Ha, 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 ha. Hello? This is your mother. Are you there? Are you coming home? Ha, 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 ha. Well, you don't know me, but I know you, and I've got a message to give to you. Here come the planes. In addition to the genealogy of voice processing as a military encryption technology, the H910 also featured an iconic glitch, a pitch ratio shutter or stutter that came from manipulating the pitch ratio of the sound that was being processed with this wavering micro pitch back and forth. And this can be heard in works by a lot of other folks, David Bowie, Suzanne Vega, many others. This glitch was addressed in later versions of the harmonizer where the glitch got fixed. But after popular demand, this glitch or technological failure was brought back into later models. Even the current software plugin version of the Eventide Harmonizer now includes this glitch, capturing the unintended little inconsistency that happened with the studio equipment as an added textural feature. What is a flaw of the harmonizer, a failure to maintain this consistent pitch ratio, became a feature purposefully built back into the tool. The vocoder and the Eventide Harmonizer make up most of the sounds in O Superman, in addition to a Farfisa synthesizer that also adds some denser textures and melodic lines in the piece. In the liner notes for Big Science, the album on which O Superman appears, Anderson writes that the album, quote, was about technology, size, industrialization, shifting attitudes toward authority and individuality. It was sometimes alarmist, picturing the country as a burning building, a plane crash. Alongside the techno was the apocalyptic, the absurd, the everyday, unquote. So, of course, we know that the initial topic and inspiration for Superman within this context was about the plane and helicopter crashes of the failed rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, during which 8 American service members were killed. Themes of failure around the piece emerged. Again, another example I want to point to in 2016 at the Penn World Voices Literary Festival in New York City, Anderson appeared alongside Chelsea Manning, queer and transgender rights activist and famed whistleblower who released via WikiLeaks thousands of documents now referred to as the Afghan war logs, Iraq war logs, and Guantanamo Bay logs. Manning has since been imprisoned again in May 2019 for refusing to testify before a grand jury examining WikiLeaks, before being released again earlier this year, having been fined $1,000 per day for her refusal to be coerced by the state to speak, a failure to comply, what I recognize as a generative and political failure to communicate in service of or be deputized by the state. While discussing Anderson's piece, O Superman, Anderson and Manning both highlighted failure, specifically the reevaluation of failure, as a primary lens through which to understand contemporary American foreign policy. O Superman, Anderson says in this interview, is about failure. And Manning commented on Anderson's creative works more broadly as all reevaluations and how her own work takes up the reevaluation of failure. One of these reevaluations I want to point to can be considered in the context of how the piece circulated again after the 9/11 attacks. Just before September 11, 2001, Anderson had begun reintroducing O Superman into her performance rotation. This was during her Life on a String tour, and it wasn't really typical for Anderson at this time to be including older pieces on her tours of her, newly released album. But nonetheless, she had, for whatever reason, added O Superman back in at this time. So on September 19th and 20th, 2001, she had it slated to be part of her set list. And she had this performance already scheduled as part of her Life on a String tour. And so 10 days following 9/11, Anderson did perform O Superman at the town hall. And in the aftermath of the concert, commentary immediately drew connections between the piece and terrorist attacks. And this was while definitions and prescriptions about what constituted terrorism were really quickly being formed and disseminated by the Bush administration and Beltway press. Commentary focused on the very eerie poignancy of these lyrics.
Ha, 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 ha. So you better get ready.
Bypass.
So you better get ready. Ready to go. You can come as you are, but pay as you go. Pay as you go. They're American planes, made in America, smoking or non-smoking.
This iteration of the song, performed on September 19th and 20th, 2001, and the kind of cultural critique and journalist coverage of the concert inspired a whole range of remixes, fan cams, which I just learned are just what you call fan videos on YouTube, and other compilations using O Superman to comment on or coincide with visual images from this time. So there are many of these fan videos commemorating 9/11 with O Superman as the soundtrack. And the piece's thematic take of the state as a maternal figure continues to resonate within this context as well, as notions of homeland emerged alongside the development of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002. When love, justice, and force have failed, of course, there's always mom. In one interview, Anderson says, quote, "We'd always been told that America was the motherland to appeal to our love of mom and dad, but it's really not like that. I put the US Post Office slogan in it too. Neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night shall stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds," unquote. The song's alignment of electronic, petrochemical, and automatic arms with state supervision situated, within the Anderson's groundbreaking use of the H910 with a vocoder and his genealogy of voice processing as a military encryption technology brings up again how these tools are ontologically, constitutively connected to these military histories, to war, to surveillance, to coded information. These tools and various contexts in which the song circulates have also grounded musicological interventions about performance, knowledge production, and form. Carolyn Abate ended her seminal 2004 article, Music, Drastic or Gnostic, by enlisting Anderson as evidence of the aporia regarding hermeneutical readings of sound. Abate suggests that Anderson's performances in Happiness from 2002, for example, exemplifies the exceptional phenomenal existence of music through the assets and limitations of secret or insider knowledge that becomes the object of hermeneutics. Abate explains that while using a contact microphone on a pair of glasses that she wore, Anderson produces anatomical sounds that imitate the sound of bodies hitting the ground from the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, captured in the 2002 documentary 9/11 by Jules and Gédéon Naudet. Abate, who recognized other references in Anderson's piece to the airplane crash in the World Trade Center towers, writes that these anatomical sounds produced, quote, "a musical translation that reveals a hidden signified that, quote, triggered real terror at the moment in her performance," unquote. Abate's piece addresses how multimedia performances such as Anderson speak across the divide of the drastic Gnostic experience of music. But Abate's focus on the instantaneous experience and registration of sound deprives performance studies, I think, from its capacity to make strong claims about how Anderson's performances are a complex imbrication of genealogy, bodies, affects, gestures, and borders. An indexical explanation of Anderson's sound production, focusing on the transformation of sound and media, might help account for the irreducible technicity that makes that sound in Abate's reduced or kind of very specific phenomenology, regardless of whether or not we engage in hermeneutic exercises or in experiential accounts of attending to Anderson. On the other hand, Susan McClary, writing in the key of hermeneutics, which of course is Abate's target, focuses on the formal characteristics of Anderson's work to argue that in O Superman, Anderson subverts the phallocentric nature of the characteristic teleological form of Western art music by omitting a clear climax or high point and release. In Feminine Endings, McClary writes that O Superman, which of course was dedicated to Jules Massenet, mirrors an aria from his opera Le Cid, which begins Au souverain, au juge, au père. McClary also draws a connection between the climax of another Massenet opera, Le Jongleur de Notre Dame, in which the main character is saved by the extended arms of a painting, and the end of O Superman, in which Anderson asks to be held by the mother's arms. McClary argues also that by performing with a wide range of electronics, Anderson displaces the male subject that typically is associated with mastery of technology. McClary shares with Abate some part of an interest or in investment, perhaps, in reductive listening. Here, animated by a comparative analysis vis-a-vis 18th and 19th century Western art music tonal procedures, bypassing the possibility, I think, of considering a more distributed sense of musicking that I argue constitutes Anderson's contribution both politically and musically. O Superman continues as a soundtrack to evaluate and reevaluate the afterlives of US empire, reanimating decades of colonial imperial projects whose ramifications persist long after they fade from the public imaginary. By approaching this piece through the ways it has circulated and gauged other crises of US intervention and militarism more generally, we see the ways in which her piece indexes a long history of failed military deployed technologies, as well as to recognize how governmental and institutional affiliations conscript us into broader systems of exploitation under the guise of technical innovation. The failures encrypted in this piece and its circulation and reperformance consistently resurface to document state failures and public disasters, reminding listeners that the state cannot rescue, save, or redeem that which the state itself has endangered. Thank you.